Books? Who needs them? Who even reads them anymore? Not me, that's for sure. Just kidding, I did read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert A. Heinlein. I've been reading a lot of Heinlein lately. Read Starship Troopers, read Stranger in a Strange Land, read Space Cadet, and now The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I enjoyed at least 60% of this book. 60% of this book I thought was fantastic. I was ready to say that this was my favorite Heinlein until about 60% of the way in. Now, this is about a lunar penal colony. This is about a penal colony on the moon that rebels against its Earth overlords to establish its sovereignty as a nation, as a planet. The Moon. This is a book about revolution. One thing that I really enjoyed about this book is it is a very much a more kind of realistic, very much a cynical look at revolution, specifically kind of a science fiction revolution. When you think of something, say, like Star Wars, there's not very much political machinations. For people will occasionally say that, like, well, George Lucas said it was about Vietnam or the Revolutionary. Yes, there are very broad political and social parallels and things, but it is essentially not very political. It is very much kind of a kind of broad, the underdogs overcoming adversity, and then everybody was happy and it was great. It's Star Wars. It's very kind of simplistic. It's broadly affirming, but you don't really think too much about it. What I like about The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. It's a very, again, sort of cynical, very sort of play-by-play look at how a revolution would take place on an interplanetary scale. One part of the book that really stuck out to me, it's some real pointed Heinlein cynicism, is that the revolutionaries, in trying to attain a free Luna, a free moon, they have to at certain times make life worse for their own citizens. So, for instance, the people are under the authority of the federated, what is it called? The Federated Nations or something. So the moon is still under the jurisdiction of the Earth, and so typically in that situation, people will get kind of complacent in their misery. They're just kind of used to being stepped on and fucked over and fucked around with. So there's a point in the book where the revolutionaries have to create conflict directed at their own citizens. So they have to create circumstances, for instance, where, say, the peacekeepers, sort of the federated nation peacekeepers, they are instigated into committing violence against the citizens of Luna. That, to me, is one of those elements where the story does stand apart from the typical kind of underdog story where it's the rebellion, the good guy rebellions. They have to strike back against the evil empire. It's a little bit more complex. The revolutionaries, for instance, they're not real big on democracy necessarily. They're big on the idea of freedom and independence from the Earth, but democracy, and not so much. For instance, there's the guy, he's just kind of known as the Prof. I forget his full name. They kind of create, once they do attain, spoilers, I guess, once they do attain independence from the Earth, as they begin to establish a new government, they just kind of put puppet candidates, like fake politicians, into positions of fake power. So it kind of maintains the illusion of democracy, the illusion of choice in leadership, but really it's still just kind of this core group of the people who instigated the revolution in the first place. It's still this kind of core leadership unit of people who know what they're doing, I appreciate Heinlein as a political writer. Again, I think that's maybe the sticking point for some people, whether you agree with him on some points or not. But I appreciate his political perspective on things. Again, it's a little more elaborate, a little more complex than just like good guy underdogs versus bad guy authoritarians. It's not afraid to look realistically at the nature of power and how people might compromise their morals in the pursuit of power, or how maybe morals don't even factor into it sometimes. Maybe like your political ambitions and your moral ambitions, sometimes they might be completely separate. Like sometimes you got to do the bad wrong thing to arrive at the good beneficial thing, as I think part of Heinlein's worldview. I like this idea that people on the moon all live in this. They all enter in these kind of weird polyamorous marriages, which I won't be able to explain that well because I feel like he doesn't explain it that well either. But it's an interesting idea that there's like multiple husbands and multiple wives all in the same sort of generational family unit. One thing that always bugs me about kind of utopian science fiction, one thing that always kind of bugs me about Star Trek and whatnot, is that in these like technological paradises where technology has basically allowed you to achieve and do anything. In Star Trek, they're always kind of like listening to classical music and painting pictures and this and that, where the reality is more like, it would look more like what we have today, where if technology really did meet all our needs, people would just be degenerate feces monsters. They would just be degenerate feces monsters, like looking at furry porn. And I appreciate kind of the cynicism in Heinlein, if that was what he was going for in this kind of weird polyamorous commune situation. I appreciate the kind of cynicism. I appreciate him actually thinking about how people would be socialized in the future. Feel like that's something that always gets lost in science fiction, is the technology is very advanced, but the socialization of people in these futuristic scientific worlds or science fictional worlds, it always very much resembles ours. Our main character of this book, who the point of view from which the book is told, his name is Manny, and he is a Russian gentleman, or Russian-esque, from Russian descent, and therein lies part of the kind of stylistic stumbling blocks of this book. I think is it's told in this kind of stilted kind of as if someone whose native language is Russian is then speaking English. So it's kind of told in this kind of caveman-esque prose, which on the one hand I appreciate the attempt at style in general. It certainly differentiates the book. You know, it's got a very specific prosaic style, but on the other hand, it can be kind of difficult to read at times, especially like at first when I first started reading it. Like when I would put the book down and then come back to it, and then I would come back to him kind of talking in caveman, and I'm like, what? So I think the book occasionally does suffer from some issues of clarity, not just in the prose, but in just, I think sometimes science fiction authors fall into the trap of over-explaining things, and Heinlein at times is no exception, especially towards the end of the book. Towards the end of the book, I feel like it's maybe 30 or 40 pages too long, this novel. Towards the end, it starts going into all the minutia of where they're throwing the rocks, on what country, and when, and it just kind of, I feel like it's reiterating things too many times for too little reason. Like, yeah, I don't know. There was a moment where the book, here's where it comes in, where about 60% through, I kind of did not enjoy the book as much. There was a moment where the book needed to ramp up to something. It needed to build up to some sort of climax, rather than, I feel like it just kind of peters out, this book. It just kind of, after the revolution, especially after the revolution, there's a lot of interesting things about forming the government and sending delegations to Earth, and kind of the little political minutia, the things that, again, do make it stand out from your typical, like, whatever, revolution in space stories. But at a certain point, it just feels like it kind of fizzles out. Characters are introduced and then seem to just kind of disappear from the picture after a while. Like Wyoming certainly after a while her character just sort of disappears. Okay, I have to back up and explain the plot a little bit. Our main character, Manny, the whatever pseudo Russian gentleman, Russian descended person, uh, he makes friends with a sentient computer. A lot of this revolution of the moon centers on a hyper intelligent AI computer who kind of masterminds a lot of the little nuts and bolts of the revolution. He's always coming up with probabilities, but he's still very much human. He's both very much this hyper intelligent AI, but as far as the book is concerned, he's still very much kind of has a human consciousness. After a while, his presence is also just kind of, you don't really feel his presence in the story anymore. He seems to be set up as a character who doesn't really have an arc, doesn't really have any defining moments. I guess this is also a spoiler. I assume people who check into something like this have read the book or something. But the computer as well just kind of dies and fizzles out at the end, and maybe it's some sort of commentary on, I don't know if the machine is supposed to be kind of this sort of pseudo divine presence, as if their revolution is divine in some sense. It kind of made me think of old Greek myths and fables where the hero's endeavor is kind of helped and overseen by the gods, Zeus and whatnot. So I don't know if the computer is supposed to be alluding to that. If the book was asking the question, like a question of sentience, if it was asking a question of like, is this machine alive? Does it qualify as a sentient creature? If the book was asking that question, I don't think it really followed through with that premise. Again, maybe the computer is supposed to be a stand-in for some moral absolute, maybe because the computer is not human, that he has some sort of, that he's, maybe the computer is then morally unassailable or something. I'm not sure quite what Heinlein was going for there necessarily. It's a great idea. Like if you were to describe this book to a person in broad strokes in better ways than I have, the first thing you would say, well, this is about a revolution on the moon against Earth that is led by a sentient AI. Anyway, the moon is a harsh mistress. There was a lot that I really liked about this book, but it's one of those cases where because there was so much that I did like about it, I really wanted a lot of the rest of it to kind of fulfill those expectations. The characters were endearing, the characters were interesting and endearing and engaging. The story, likewise, but then it just felt like it sort of spent too much time kind of meandering and kind of petered out. Eventually, just kind of wandered off in a different direction. Would I recommend it? Yeah, I guess. There's enough good ideas here. There's enough good ideas. There's enough good here that outweighs kind of the bad, I think, or not the bad is a strong word, that outweighs the disappointing. I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. It was okay. It was fine. Anyway, that's all I got for The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I think for this Halloween season, I'm going to read some H.P. Lovecraft stories, reread some H.P. Lovecraft stories, and that will be some nice, spooky Halloween times. Goodbye!